He fired one shot, a man died, and then the German sniper did the only thing his entire life had trained him to do. He waited for the second shot. Not his own, theirs. Because in every battle he had ever fought, the second shot was the one that mattered. The first man you kill is only the bait. The second man, the frightened one who stands up, who runs, who lifts his head to look, that man is the real kill. He had eaten off that second man 100 times, in Russia, in France, everywhere. So he lay in the hedge with his finger on the trigger and his eye pressed to the finest telescopic glass in the world, and he waited for the Americans to give him what they always gave him. And nothing happened. No one stood, no one ran, no one lifted his head. The field had simply gone flat, as if the men in it had been swallowed by the grass. He waited 1 minute, then 2. His finger stayed on the trigger, and somewhere in the back of that cold, disciplined mind, a question began to open like a wound. A question that would follow him into the dark for the rest of his short life. A question that, by the end of that summer, would spread through the German sniper corps in Normandy like a sickness no doctor could name. Why won't they give me the second shot? He thought he was fighting a man. He was wrong. And by the time he understood what he was really fighting, it was already crawling toward his hedge with a map, and a radio, and a rain of steel, and it had learned his name. This is the story of how one of the finest killers of the entire war lay down in a French orchard, took one perfect shot after another, and slowly went mad waiting for an answer that would never come. Because the war he had trained his whole life to fight had just died in the grass in front of him. He simply hadn't been told yet. My grandfather told me this story once. Only once. And he made me promise to remember the part everyone else always forgot. Let me start where he started. My grandfather almost never talked about the war. 40 years he kept it behind his teeth. He would sit on the porch in the evening with his coffee going cold and his eyes somewhere far across the fields, and if you asked him what he did in France, he would only say, "I carried a radio," and that was the end of it. That was all you were getting. He would change the subject, or he would go quiet, and after a while, you learned not to ask. But one night, near the very end, when he was sick, and the medicine had loosened something in him that 40 years of silence had held shut, he told me about the hedgerows, and he told me about a German who would not stop waiting. I have spent a long time since then trying to decide what it was he described to me. Whether it was just war, just the ordinary madness of men killing each other in a field until the field ran out of men, or whether there was something else out there in that green country that summer. Something patient, something that did not understand that the rules had changed. I still do not know which answer frightens me more. So I am going to tell it to you exactly the way he told it to me, and I am going to let you decide for yourself. His name was Walter. That is the name they found later, stamped on a small metal disc, and it is the only name I have, so it is the one I will use. But we did not know Walter yet, of course. In June of 1944, he was only a shape in a hedge, and we were only meat in a field, and neither side knew the other's name. The names came later. The names came from the notebook, but I am getting ahead of myself, and my grandfather hated when a story ran ahead of itself, so let me slow down and start with the morning the second shot did not come. The morning smelled of wet earth and crushed apples. That is the detail my grandfather always came back to, every time, right at the start. The apples. Normandy was orchard country, and the shelling had knocked half the fruit off the trees, and it lay rotting in the tall grass, so that the whole front smelled sweet and rotten at the same time, like something dying slowly and quietly all around you. He said you never forgot that smell. He said it followed him home across an ocean and stayed with him the rest of his life, so that even decades later, an orchard in autumn could stop him cold in his tracks and take the color out of his face. The company was moving out of a tree line into an open field. My grandfather was near the back, with the radio riding heavy on his shoulders, 30 pounds of iron and wire, the whip antenna swaying above his head, like a finger pointing him out to God and everybody who wanted him dead. Up front was the lieutenant, a young man, Ohio. He had a habit of pointing at things with his whole open hand, flat, the way a man might bless something. My grandfather said he could still see that hand, 40 years later, the way it came up flat and easy and pointed across the field at the far hedgerow. And the far hedgerow killed him. One shot, just one. My grandfather said you never really hear the shot that takes a man beside you. You hear the crack and the falling as if they are the same event, as if the sound itself reached out across the field and folded the man over. The lieutenant went down into the tall grass and did not get up, and for one long, terrible second, nobody moved at all. And then, and this is the part he wanted me to understand, this is the part he took my hand for, nobody moved at all, for a very long time. Nobody ran, nobody stood, nobody screamed the lieutenant's name and went crawling out to drag him back. 20-odd men went flat into the grass at the same instant, like a single animal lying down, and they stayed there, faces in the dirt, breathing into the roots, and they did not move. My grandfather said the silence after that shot was worse than the shot itself, because every man lying in that grass knew exactly what was supposed to happen next, and every man had trained himself against everything his own body was screaming at him to make sure it did not. Now let me take you across the field. Let me put you inside the hedge, behind the glass, so you understand what Walter was waiting for. Because his confusion is the whole heart of this. He had been in that hedge since before dawn. Hours. He had crawled into it in the dark and dug himself a hollow at the base of the hawthorn and roofed it over with living branches, so that even in daylight there was nothing to see but hedge. His rifle was a Carabiner 98, hand-picked off the factory line for its accuracy, and mounted above it was a small telescopic sight, the finest optical glass the world had yet made, worth more than a working man earned in months. The Germans did not hand those scopes to just anyone. You earned it. And you did not earn it by being a good shot. Plenty of men were good shots. You earned it by being still. That was the secret they beat into their snipers, over and over, until it was carved into the bone. It is not about the shooting. It is about the stillness. They had a saying for it, roughly this: sniping is 10 parts hiding and 1 part firing. A sniper who shoots is a sniper who is about to die. A sniper who waits is a sniper who grows old. Everything Walter was, everything that made him deadly, was patience. He could lie in one spot for an entire day and take a single shot, or no shot at all, and then melt back into the country as if he had never been there. So Walter waited. In the grey light before the company came, he watched the field, and he chose his ground, and he settled in to become part of it. And when the Americans came out of the tree line, he let the point man walk right past. He was not interested in a private. A private was nothing. He was hunting the one who pointed, the one the others turned toward, the one with the flat, easy, blessing hand. And when he had him, he took him. Clean. One squeeze, one crack, and the man folded. And then Walter settled his cheek back down onto the smooth wood of the stock, and he breathed out slow, and he waited for the reward. Because there was always a reward. In every battle Walter had ever fought, and by June of 1944 he had fought a great many, first far away in the east against the Russians in the snow and the rubble, and now here in the green, the first shot had never been the real kill. The first shot was the bait. You drop the leader, and the men around him lose their minds. One stands up to run, one kneels over the body, one lifts his head just an inch, just for a second, to see where death had come from. And that man, the second man, the frightened one, was the easiest kill in all of warfare. Walter had lived on the second man for years. So he lay in the sweet, rotten-smelling hedge with his finger resting on the trigger and his eye against the glass, and he waited for one of them to give it to him. And nobody did. A minute went by. My grandfather, down in the grass, was counting his own heartbeats into the dirt, and he said he got past 200 and stopped. Walter, across the field, was counting too. I am certain of it, and every second that ticked by without a second target was a second his entire life could not explain. Because a soldier who does not stand, does not run, does not lift his head to look for his fallen officer, that is not a coward. Walter knew cowards. Cowards were easy. Cowards were his daily bread. This was the opposite of a coward. This was a man doing the single hardest thing a human being can do on a battlefield, which is to lie beside his dying friend and do absolutely nothing, on purpose, because he understands that doing something is exactly what the killer wants. That is not fear. Fear makes you move. This was the thing that beats fear. This was discipline. And Walter, lying in his perfect hide, with his perfect glass and his perfect patience, felt something he had not felt in a long time. A small, cold question, opening up in the middle of his chest. Why won't they give me the second shot? He did not know it yet, but that question was going to hunt him for the rest of his life. And it was not only him. That summer, all up and down the German line, the snipers began coming back with the same look on their faces and the same words in their mouths. The Americans do not react right anymore. Something is wrong out there. Something in the field has changed. They were right. Something had changed. And not one of them could say what it was. I am going to tell you what it was. But I want you to feel it first the way they felt it. As a wrongness. As a thing that should not be happening. Happening anyway, again and again, in field after field. Now come back down into the grass with my grandfather. Because while Walter waited, my grandfather was doing the thing that saved every man in that field. And it was not brave, and it was not dramatic, and there is not a single movie that has ever shown it right. He was lying on his side, very slowly, so slowly it did not even look like movement, drawing the radio handset down to his mouth. He was not calling for help. He was doing arithmetic. Here is the arithmetic they had beaten into him. When a hidden shot drops a man, you do not react to the man. You react to the sound. And then, cold and fast, you think about what the shooter wants. Because whatever he wants, you are going to do the exact opposite. He wants you to run, so you freeze. He wants you to bunch together for comfort, so you spread apart. He wants you to fire back wildly into the hedges, so he can watch your muzzle flashes and count exactly how blind and how lost you are. So you do not fire a single round. You give him nothing. You give him a field full of men who have simply stopped existing. And while you are giving him nothing with one hand, with the other hand, very quietly, you find out precisely where he is. My grandfather said those minutes were the worst of his whole war. Not the shooting, the waiting. Lying 10 yards from a lieutenant he liked, a kid from Ohio who blessed things with his open hand, hearing him breathe wrong in the grass, and not going to him, because going to him was the trap. The lieutenant was still bait, alive or dead, and the only way to make his death count for anything was to leave him lying exactly where he had fallen and use the time to find the man who had done it. That is the cost nobody puts in the stories. The thing that beat the German snipers was not clever, and it was not heroic. It was cold. It asked living men to lie beside a dying friend and count. Now, here is a thing you have to understand about a rifle shot in that country. In the hedgerows, a single shot is one of the hardest sounds in all of warfare to place. The hedgerows were not bushes. They were earthen walls, 10 feet high, centuries old, grown solid with root and thorn, and they bounced sound around like the inside of a great bell. One crack seemed to come from everywhere at once. Walter's entire survival was built on that fact. Fire once, and the enemy fires back into 3 wrong hedges, and every wrong shot is fresh proof that they cannot find you. So Walter waited for that too. The blind, angry return fire, the comforting music of Americans emptying their rifles into empty bushes, and that never came either. No panic, no second target, no blind fire. Just that patient, disciplined, unbearable silence. A silence that matched his own so exactly that it must have felt, to a man alone in a hedge, almost like hearing his own reflection breathe. And that cold question in his chest, sharpened now into something much closer to fear. They are not shooting back because they do not need to see me. He was right, that is exactly why. But he was reaching for the wrong reason. And the wrong reason is where this story turns strange, because here is what Walter believed. Here is what every German sniper believed. Here is the thing that made all of this so impossible for them to understand. He believed he was fighting a man. He believed that out there in the grass was another marksman, a mind like his own. Same instincts, same rules, same fears. He believed the two of them were locked into the old, honorable, terrible duel that snipers had fought since men first learned to lie still and wait. Patience against patience, glass against glass, nerve against nerve. He believed that if he simply waited long enough, outstilled the other man, the American would eventually make the small human mistake that all men make, and Walter would win. Because Walter always won. That was the whole shape of his world. But there was no other man. That is the thing my grandfather needed me to understand, and it took me years to feel the full weight of it. There was no rival sniper hiding in the grass. The Americans had not sent their finest marksman to duel the Germans' finest marksman. They had looked at that duel, a duel they would very likely lose, because their scopes fogged in the rain, and their rifles were second-rate hunting guns, thrown together in a hurry by a country that had entered the war without a real sniper program at all. They had looked at that duel, and they had simply refused to have it. Instead, they had sent a 19-year-old boy from Pennsylvania with a 30-pound radio on his back and a grid map in his pocket, and one clear order: do not be a hero, do not duel him, find the hedge and let the hedge answer for him. Walter was lying in the grass waiting to outfence a swordsman, and there was no swordsman. There was only the machine. Far away now, a new sound began. Not a rifle, something deeper, a wet, coughing thump, and then, after a pause, another, spaced out and patient and unhurried. Every man in Normandy knew that sound. My grandfather knew it, and Walter, lying in his hedge, knew it best of all. Mortars. Here is the part of the war the sniper legends never tell you, and it is the part that decides everything that happens next. In Normandy, most men were not killed by the man aiming at them. Most men were killed by steel that fell out of the sky, dropped by other men who never saw them and never would. Roughly 3 out of every 4 American casualties in that campaign came not from a bullet with a human eye behind it, but from indirect fire. Mortars, artillery, the impersonal rain. That was the true face of death in that war, and it did not have a face at all. The Americans knew this. They knew it intimately, because the Germans had been doing it to them since the beaches, killing them by the hundred with shells fired from behind hills they never saw. And somewhere in those first bloody weeks in the hedgerows, some American officer had a cold and brilliant and ugly thought. Why fight the sniper at all? Why send a good man to outshoot him and probably die doing it, when you could find the hedgerow he was in, not the bush, just the hedgerow, and drop a curtain of steel across the whole length of it and let simple physics do the aiming? A sniper is one man in 100 yards of hedge. You do not need to find the man. You only need to find the hedge. And the boy in the grass with the radio had just found the hedge. The first round walked in short. Walter felt the ground jump beneath his belly. The second came closer. And now Walter's discipline, the very thing that had kept him alive through the whole long war, through the snow of Russia and the ruin of the East and everything after, became the exact thing that was going to kill him. Because his entire training said, stay still. Stillness is life. Stillness is everything. But stillness was now a marked box on an American's map, and the steel was finding the box. He did the only thing left to him. He moved. And the instant he moved, he became the one thing he had spent his entire life refusing to be. A visible man. Up out of the ground. Running. In the open. In a field. They did not get him that day. My grandfather was careful about that, every time he told it. The mortars walked across the far hedgerow and tore it apart and set the smashed hawthorn smoking. And at last the company rose up out of the grass and carried the lieutenant back, and every man assumed the sniper was dead somewhere in that wreckage. He was not. Walter got out. Walter always got out. That was the terrible thing about him. Because over the next 3 weeks, in that same small patch of hedgerows, it kept happening. And this is the part where my grandfather's voice always dropped, on that dark porch, near the end. This is the part I have never fully been able to explain. The company would move. A single shot would come from somewhere in the green. A man would fall. Never a private. Always someone who mattered. A sergeant. A lieutenant. A forward observer once. And once a captain who had come up to see the ground for himself. Always the man who pointed. Always one shot. And then that patient, waiting silence. And then, if they were quick enough with the radio, the mortars. And then the smoke. But they never got him. In 3 weeks, they never once got him, and they never once saw him. No muzzle flash. No glint of glass in the sun. No movement in the endless green. A single man was hunting the leadership of an entire company, one perfect shot at a time, and he was leaving no more trace than a ghost leaves on a window pane. And the men began to talk the way men talk when they are frightened, and will not say the word. They stopped calling him the sniper. They started calling him the patient man. You have to understand what 3 weeks of that does to a body of men. It was not the deaths, exactly. Men died all the time. Death was the job. It was the pattern. It was the growing, crawling certainty that something out there in the green maze understood them better than they understood themselves. It knew who the leaders were. It knew to take only them. It knew to wait, and it knew, somehow, never to be found. My grandfather said men stopped pointing. Officers took the rank off their collars and stopped carrying maps out in the open and stopped giving orders with their hands. A lieutenant who blessed something with a flat, open palm was a lieutenant volunteering to die, and everyone knew it. The whole company changed the way it moved, the way it stood, the way it spoke, all of it, because of one man that not a single one of them had ever laid eyes on. And here is the strangest part of the whole thing, the part that sits in the dead center of this story, like a cold stone at the bottom of a well. Walter was just as haunted as they were. We know that now, because of the notebook. They found it in August, when the front finally broke and rolled east, and the graves teams went through the shattered hedgerows, counting the dead of both sides. He was in a hide he had dug into the base of a hedge and roofed over with living, growing branches, so well made that the searchers walked past it twice before one of them saw the barrel of the sniper's rifle poking from the green. He had been killed at last by a mortar fragment. The impersonal rain had finally found him, the way it found nearly everyone in the end. There was no glory in it, and no duel, and no last stand. He was simply one more body in a green wall already full of bodies. But he had kept a small notebook tucked inside his jacket against his chest, and an officer who read German translated a little of it, and it went around the company hand to hand, and one line of it in particular got copied out onto scraps of paper and passed from man to man until the paper wore soft as cloth. My grandfather carried his copy of that line for 40 years. He read it to me off the back of an old envelope, in the dark, in a voice I had never heard him use before. I will read it to you the way he read it to me. He wrote, "They will not give me the second shot. I take the first man, and I wait, and there is nothing. There is no fear in them. They lie down in the grass like the dead, and they do not move. And I know that while I lie here waiting for them, something else is already coming for me. I am hunting men who will not behave like men. I begin to think I am not fighting soldiers at all. I am fighting the ground itself. The ground has learned my name. The ground has learned my name." He wrote that, we believe, about 10 days before the fragment found him. A man alone in a hedge, one of the finest killers his country ever produced, slowly coming apart at the seams because the enemy had stopped behaving like an enemy and had started behaving like something patient and faceless and everywhere at once. He had come to believe the field itself was hunting him. And here is the thing I have turned over in my hands 1,000 times since that night on the porch. The thing I cannot put down. He was right. He was right, and he was wrong. And the narrow space between those two things is the entire meaning of what happened in those hedgerows. He was wrong that it was something supernatural. I want to be honest about that, because my grandfather was honest about it with me. There was no ghost in the bocage. There was no thing in the green maze that knew his name in the way he feared. It was not magic. Every single piece of what killed Walter was a real and explainable thing, made by real and frightened men. But he was right that he was not fighting a man, because by the summer of 1944, the age of the lone marksman winning a battle by himself was quietly and permanently over, and Walter was one of the very last men still alive who had not been told. He was fighting a war that no longer existed. He had trained his entire life to defeat another individual, to be more patient than one man, to be more still than one man, to be better with glass and steadier of hand than one man. And he was. He truly was. To the very end, in a straight and honest duel, Walter would have beaten almost anyone alive. But there was no one to duel. What came for Walter was not a person. It was a system. It was a 19-year-old with a radio who had been ordered to be forgettable. It was a grid map and a whispered coordinate. It was hard lessons carried back from the beaches by terrified men and printed onto paper and pushed forward fast so that a company bleeding out in a field in July already knew the thing that another company had died to learn in June. It was mortar crews a full mile back who never saw him and never once needed to. It was ordinary discipline, poured into ordinary men, day after day, until they could lie beside a dying friend and do the arithmetic instead of the crying. And here is the point. Not one piece of that machine, on its own, was as good as Walter. The radio man was not as brave as Walter. The mortar crew could not shoot the way Walter could shoot. The lessons printed on the paper were not as clever or as cunning as Walter. Man for man, thing for thing, Walter was better than all of it. But together, coordinated, relentless, patient, and utterly willing to wait, they did not have to be as good as Walter. They only had to be a ground that had learned his name. That is the thing my grandfather understood in the end, that Walter never quite could. Walter kept waiting for the second shot, because the second shot was the last piece of a world he still believed in. A world where two skilled men faced one another across a field, and the better man won. And it meant something. He fired one perfect shot after another into that vanished world, night after night, week after week, and he waited for it to answer him the way it had always answered him before. And it never answered. The panic never came. The second man never stood up. The blind return fire never sprayed the wrong hedge. The duel he had built his whole life around simply never happened. There was only that silence in the grass, that patient, terrible, deliberate silence, sitting exactly where his easy second kill was supposed to be. He thought it was the ground come alive against him. It was not. It was the future. It was the exact moment, in one green field in France, when the individual, no matter how skilled, no matter how patient, no matter how perfect his glass, or steady his hand, stopped being able to hold back the machine. And a very good soldier lay in a hedge that he had built with his own two hands, and he felt that future crawling toward him through the grass, and he reached for words to describe the horror of it, and the only words he could find were the words of a haunting. The ground has learned my name. My grandfather died the winter after he told me all of this. I have the envelope still, with the German line copied out in his shaking hand. I have had people who know this history look at the pieces of it, and every piece holds up. The way the German snipers were trained, the rule of the second shot, the way they fired only 2 or 3 times from a position and then vanished, because a fourth shot was how you died, the lessons the Americans carried back from the beaches, the mortars that answered the rifle. All of it is real. That is the strange thing. There is nothing in this story that has to be a ghost. Nothing at all. And yet there is the notebook. There is a man who never met my grandfather, lying on the far side of a field, writing down the exact same silence that my grandfather felt in the grass 10 yards from a dying friend, and calling it the very same thing. A wrongness, a patience that should not have been there, a sense that the field itself had turned against the old rules of men. 2 enemies, 10 yards and a whole world apart, both feeling the same impossible thing in the same terrible summer, and both of them reaching, independently, for the language of the uncanny to describe it. Because sometimes the truth is stranger than a ghost. Sometimes the thing hunting you in the dark is not a monster at all. Sometimes it is just the future, arriving a little early, wearing the empty and patient face of a field. So when people ask me what my grandfather did in the war, I still tell them exactly what he told everyone, for 40 years, on that porch, with his coffee going cold. He carried a radio. I just do not tell them what the radio really was. I do not tell them it was the thing that learned the sniper's name. I do not tell them that somewhere under a hedgerow in Normandy, one of the best killers who ever lived spent the last weeks of his life convinced that the ground itself had come alive to hunt him, and that he was, in the only way that truly mattered, completely correct. The Germans waited for a second shot. It never came. And the reason it never came is the same reason the whole world looked different when the war was finally over, because the second shot belonged to the old war, the war of one man against one man, the war of the duel, and the better shot, and the honorable field. And that war died in the grass of a French orchard, in the summer of 1944, while the air smelled of wet earth and crushed apples, and not one man who was lying in that grass, on either side of that field, ever forgot the silence where the second shot was supposed